Heavenly Father, as we take up this study again, we ask that you would guide and direct our thoughts, our presentation, that it might be a blessing to all that would hear it. We need your Holy Spirit. We ask for that now. We pray that you'd pour the latter rain down upon us, and that you'd give us insight through your prophetic word of the things that are transpiring on a daily basis now on planet Earth, that we might be among those that raise the final warning. In Jesus' name, amen. I said that we would use the notes from yesterday, but I took what we didn't get through and reworked it a little bit. So today's notes, I have the midnight chiasm there on page 1. I want to show something over here. And we're saying the midnight chiasm for the priests was September 7th. November 9th and January 11th, 3 points in the chiasm. September 7th, 63 days to November 9th, 63 days then to January 11th. We've dealt with that quite a bit. We've also dealt with how these various lines of history line up with that, such as the 126, because there was 126 days in that history of September 7th to January 11th. We put the 126 years of Advent history from 1863 to 1989 into that model, saying that history also illustrates the midnight chiasm. And we put the 1260 years of the beginning of the 2520 from 723 BC, then 538 in the middle, 1798 the end. And then I put in the mix yesterday, if you haven't thought it through yet, that we've always lined up the 2520 that begins in 723 with the week that Christ confirms the covenant. So I have the 70th week representing that week, and I have 8027, the center point, of course, the cross, and the ending point 8034. And then underneath that you have a familiar diagram by now, I suppose. And I've been calling this the Levitical chiasm. And these terms, I hang on these various things. There isn't anything sanctified about them. I put terms on them so that we have a common point to consider something. But as time goes on, you might get a better term, a better expression for it. But I'm kind of reworking this now on the name of this, what I was calling the Levitical chiasm. I'm calling it midnight for the Levites, because you can see that midnight for the Levites is also illustrated in this March 27th, March 27th, March 27th. So underneath that diagram you have March 27, 2019, March 27, 2020, and March 27, 2021. And underneath that on your notes, you have 27 AD, which is the baptism. And then 31 AD, I have Roman execution. And then 34 AD, I have Jewish execution. And the reason I'm making that point is I have been making a point for some time now that the baptism is the cross. The baptism is an illustration of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ in AD 27, and therefore that history of AD 27 corresponds with the history of AD 31, which is the death, burial, and resurrection in reality. But the cross was execution by the Romans, and AD 34 is an illustration of an execution by the Jews when they stoned Stephen. So I just want us to see that all three of these waymarks in this week that Christ confirmed the covenant, at one level they're the same. Okay, and the reason I'm doing that is I'm going to argue that 27 AD is a symbol of March 27th. And therefore, in the week that Christ confirms the covenant, we have 27, 27, 27 AD, because 31 AD was typified by 27 AD, and 34 AD was typified by 27 AD. So I'm saying that line is an argument that the Levitical chiasm of March 27th, 2019, 20, and 21 are these 27s. And then you see some of these mathematical revelations. March 27th is 327, and 3 times 27 equals 81. What's 81 a symbol of? Midnight. And 27, 27, 27 is 81. 327 plus 327 plus 327 is 981.
What do you got the 9 for? I don't understand that one. 981.
981.
Yeah.
You notice that the 81 is boldface?
Yeah.
That's because the square root of 81 is 9. So in 981, you have also 81, which is a symbol of midnight. When you add 327, 327, 327, or if you just add 27, 20, 20, 27, 27, 27, you're coming up with 81, a symbol of midnight. So in these chiasms that we've laid our fingers on and came to understand, we see these internal signatures of Palmoni to confirm that we're on the right track, such as the one for midnight that we're familiar with, where 9/7, November 9th, and January 11th, it'll add up at one level to March 27th in the English calendar, and at another level it adds up to November or to January 11th in the European calendar. There's these mathematical revelations within the chiastic structure that speak to what it is. So I'm saying this 81 is telling us that this is midnight for the Levites. And I'm saying that March 27th is also 273. And that 273, 2 plus 7, 2 times 7 times 3 is 42. 42 is a symbol of persecution. 42 months of the papal persecution, which is 1260, that comes across 3.5 days. 42, persecution, and 2 plus 7 plus 3 is 12, and 12 is a symbol of the 144,000. So the story of the Levitical midnight chiastic structure there is in 2019, the message was put in place, March 27th, 2 messages about the shut door, and 1863. Telling Adventism that in 1863 the door was shut on you being a righteous people, I guess the way to say it. They went into apostasy now. And then in 2020, on March 27th, you have the 100 Days of Prayer, which is the formalization of their message. And then in 2021, you have the final sealing, okay, from March 27th, 2021 until December 27th, 2021. 25. December 25th, 2021, you have the sealing that takes place just prior to the Sunday law, where the Levites are settled into truth spiritually and intellectually, so they cannot be moved. And what I'm hoping you see is that what this does is it puts the wheel, the chiastic structure of the Levites, into the wheel of the priests. Okay, the midnights now suddenly are the same history. And what is the illustration of Adventism that Sister White points to? More often than not. Great controversy. The parable of the 10 virgins of Matthew 25 illustrates the experience of the Adventist people. So what I'm saying is in this Levitical chiastic structure, which I'm now arguing is the midnight chiastic structure for the Levites, at the very first March 27th, you have a voice saying the door was closed on you in 1863. And that's what the parable says. At midnight there is a cry made, behold the bridegroom cometh, and the virgins wake up. So this chiastic structure is illustrating the awakening of the Levites. And for us, back here is midnight for the priests, But over here, before they even get here, before we even get to our midnight, this is 3/27/2019. Before we even get to our midnight, the Lord is beginning to awaken the Adventists, the Levites. Here's where their message is formalized. And then down here, in this history, would leave this period here, which is a period of 273 days after March 27th, 2021. And I'm saying in this history, this 273 is talking about the final settling into the truth of the Levites before they hit the Sunday law. But what I'm hoping you're seeing is that this identifies that our midnight in here, their midnight, they're in the midnight history with us. And we are the ones that are chosen to awaken them. There's always been a question, people always, not always, but many times, people raise this question. In the parable of the 10 virgins, who is it that gives the cry? You know, if all the virgins are asleep, none of them are awake, who gives the cry? My answer has always been, well, it's the message that's being identified. But here, with the Levites, it's the priests that give the cry, that awaken them. So the message was formalized on March 27, 2020, and I broke this out a little bit. As we began to discuss it yesterday, maybe I forgot some things, but just looking at this statement by the Adventist Church, which I'm saying is the formalization of their message, I'm on page 2. And my argument yesterday, and I'm standing with it, is 1831, William Miller sent in an article that becomes his first public presentation to the Vermont Telegraph. And we published the Time at the End magazine. So the Millerites published their own formalization. We published as priests our own formalization. The Levites are going to have to publish their own formalization, and this is it, this 100 days of prayer. And I'd say 100 is also 10, and 10 is a test. Okay, they have 100 days of testing period now, whether they're actually going to respond to the characteristics of this call to prayer. And I'd say that the characteristics of this call to prayer will manifest in two different ways, either as wise or foolish Levites. Okay, if you're not going to, they call for revival as an example. You're either going to buy in during the next 100 days as a Seventh-day Adventist to the false revival or the true revival, because the Lord's bringing it all to a conclusion. Okay, you have March 27th mentioned there. We've already went through characteristics of March 27th. It's 81. It's midnight. July 4th is what? Independence Day. Independence removed. Okay, we're heading into a time period when the independence of the United States is going to be removed. At the end of their 100 days of prayer, just before, what is that? 2 weeks before July 18th. You've got COVID-19. COVID, the abbreviation for corona. Coronavirus. What's corona? It's a Latin word for sun. What's a virus? It's a sickness. Okay, so my logic is it's the sun virus. And the sun virus is the mark of the beast. You follow the logic? Sunday worship is deadly when you observe it during a testing time over Sabbath and Sunday. It's the virus. It's the COVID-19. 19, we've been dealing with that a little bit more than recently than in the past. The 19 years at the beginning of the 2520 chiasm and the 19 years at the end of the 2520 chiasm, and we looked at the book Education, chapter 19, and I'm saying that the 19 represents the history that illustrates end-time Bible prophecy, but more specifically, it's the history at the beginning and the ending of the 2520. It is a symbol of the 2520, which is a covenant relationship. If you accept the premises of the the covenant, you will be saved. If you reject them, you will be scattered. So COVID-19 is identifying the test as the mark of the beast test, and the 2520 is identifying either the curse or the blessing that will be followed depending on how you relate to the test. And their call from Adventism was for personal consecration. 3, revival, outpouring for the Holy Spirit, and to be the light of the world. And I'm saying those 5 calls in that test are representing either wise or foolish virgins in the Levites, in Adventism. Okay, depending on how you count it, if you count from January 11th and count January 11th, or if you start on January 12th, it's 76 days from January 11th at the time of the end for the Levites until March 27th, 2020. And 77 days if you include January 11th. 76, 7 times 6 is 42. Once again, persecution. 7 plus 6 equals 13, a symbol of rebellion. And 7 times 7 is 49, which is a symbol of probationary time. So the time period between the unsealing of the book of Daniel for the Levites on January 11th and March 27th, when they give this proclamation, those are the 3 things you can read into the numerology if you choose to, yes.
You notice it's 2 weeks before July 18, and a lot of times it's 2 years. Now it's going into 2 weeks, and maybe the next time we notice something, it'll be 2 hours.
Or 2 days.
Or 2 days, and then maybe 2 hours, yeah.
Getting closer and closer.
But with the 2.
Okay, so now I'm switching gears back to where we were yesterday. We tracked the apostasy of Adventism. You can see on the top of page 3. We noted certain dates: 1863, 1881, 83, 84, 86, and then 88. And then in 1892, Sister White is exiled. And I'm claiming that at that point, in the 1844 time period, the Lord raised up, was trying to finalize the Protestant Reformation, and Adventism was given that mantle, and Adventism in 1863 dropped it. Apostate Protestantism became Apostate Protestantism on the first day of the first month in 1844. So they have a storyline, Apostate Protestantism in the United States. But the Adventist Church has a storyline that begins in 1863 as well. And this coming to Carmel gives you 2 false prophets, priests of the grove, prophets of Baal. And we track the history of the false prophet that is apostate Protestantism from 1863, when the National Reform Movement began. And the National Reform Movement is ultimately going to be in 1989, at the end of 126 years from 1863. It's going to become the Christian Coalition doing the same work. I hope you remember those passages, a few passages that I read on the National Reform Movement, where Sister White emphasized that this is the very present truth message of the third angel, the work of the National Reform Movement in her history. And we read from A.T. Jones, where he tied together the Blair Bill and the work of the National Reform Movement, and he identified that in 1892 they got what they wanted, though nobody really seemed to see it, when the Supreme Court unanimously ruled that the United States was a Christian nation. Okay, and that's still on the record books. And to A.T. Jones, that was more important to the National Reform Movement than the Sunday law itself, because that's the premise that justifies enforcing a Sunday law. So I'm saying that the beginning of Adventism, that history is repeated at the end, and that history began at the time of the end in 1798, and the end begins in 1989. So now we're going to track the ending of apostate Protestantism, one of 2 false prophets, the other one being Adventism. And so it says 1989 in the Christian Coalition. In preparation for his campaign for the presidency in 1988, religious broadcaster Marion G. Pat Robertson created an effective grassroots organization known as Freedom Council in several states. Though defeated, Robertson made a surprisingly strong showing and determined to create a more permanent political organization that could help elect Christian candidates to public office and gain substantial power within the Republican Party. The result was the Christian Coalition, launched in 1989. So I'm saying prophetically, this is the national reform movement. Therefore, prophetically, this is the third angel's message that very few people recognize is the third angel's message.
We didn't realize it was the third angel's message, but we preached.
No, I've used those same quotes. I use those same quotes and emphasize that identical thing.
Man, we
You
pound
just
that
forgot.
drum a long time.
The result of it was the Christian Coalition launched a night. These quotes here are just, I went into the old stuff and just cut and pasted. With the assistance of its first executive director, Ralph Reed. So Ralph Reed comes into the story in 1989. We're going to talk about him more, but right now we're talking about Robertson. Under Reed's leadership, the organization grew steadily until in 1996. Now remember, we're tracking certain waymarks in these histories of apostasy. In 1996, it claimed a membership of, and this is only 7 years later, from 1989 to 1996, it claimed a membership of 1.9 million and 2,000 chapters across the country and a budget of 26.5 million. What's 1996? It's where it's formalized, okay? The Christian cult, this movement now is formalized. Now, here's a couple expressions of the mentality of the guy that started it, Pat Robertson. There is no such thing as separation of church and state in the Constitution. It is a lie of the left, and we're not going to take it anymore. Pat Robertson's 1993 address to the American Center for Law and Justice. The American Center for Law and Justice, I can't remember the guy that's the head of that right now.
Falwell Jr., wasn't it?
Maybe it's Falwell, but I'm thinking about the attorney, the attorney.
Jay Sekulow.
Sekulow, okay, because Sekulow is someone that Fox News is always referring to. I just wanted to bring that in. He has his own broadcast as well, but there is a definite and total connection with Fox News. Another thing that Pat Robertson said, and somewhere over the years I lost the reference, but this is a valid statement by him. The mission of the Christian Coalition is simple. It's to mobilize Christians one precinct at a time. And I have this one precinct at a time boldface for a reason. One community at a time until once again we are the head and not the tail, and the top and not the bottom of our political system. The Christian Coalition will be the most powerful political force in America by the end of this decade. That's the year 2000, he would be predicting this. When we have enough votes to run this country, and when the people say we've had enough, we're going to take over. Okay, so by the year 2000 was his goal. And then from 1989 to 1994, it says in 1989 the Christian Coalition began. By 1984 it has 94, it has representatives in every voting precinct in the United States. You take Arkansas, and they take Arkansas or any other state and they cut it up into voting precincts. I have no idea how many voting precincts, little areas in Arkansas that Arkansas is divided into, but just as to make my point, say they cut it up into 20 voting precincts in Arkansas. Okay. By 1994, this really has to sink in. By 1994, they had representatives representing their movement in every voting precinct in the United States, and there has never been a time in the history of the United States that the Republican and Democratic Party has had representatives in every voting precinct in the United States. Now, I could stand corrected now because that used to be true, absolute airtight true, when I used to present this in the late 1890s, and 1990s and right after 2000. Maybe now Republicans and Democrats have members in every voting precinct. But when did the Democratic Party begin? At the very beginning of the country. When did the Republican Party begin? The Civil War with Lincoln. So they begin in 1989, and in, what is that? 94 from 89, that's 5 years, is it? In 5 years, they had already representatives in every voting precinct in the United States.
In 2004, they had 174,252 precincts in the United States.
Repeat.
What was the number?
174,252 different precincts.
So 174,000 voting precincts plus some in the United States. And in 5 years, they had represented. So anyway, all I'm emphasizing is how rapidly and how thorough they grew. You remember when we started hearing about InfoWars, when the Omega was raising its ugly head. The reality of it, the first time you're going to hear of anyone that is a master at using computers to build a political machine is Ralph Reed. That's what did it, was Ralph Reed in 1989. He started there. He may not have been using some of the more sophisticated things they're using now through Google and that, because that wasn't in existence. But that's what made Ralph Reed famous. Now, I want you to notice something here, because we're not really in tune with everything that we should be in tune with. But if you go back up to the top of the page, you see where it says 1884 and the false prophet begins, the middle line, and then we track the dates for the false prophet beginning, and it has 1892, the Supreme Court. The reason I had 1892 in the Supreme Court there is because we read A.T. Jones yesterday, and he says in 1892 the National Reform Movement got what they wanted because the Supreme Court ruled unanimously that the United States was a Christian nation. So one of the waymarks, one of the high points for the National Reform Movement in their beginning history was it was the Supreme Court. I'll just leave it at that. And you're going to see something about the Supreme Court in Pat Robertson's statement now, because that was their goal too. July 17, 2003, Pat Robertson calls for a change on the Supreme Court. We the people, the opening words of the U.S. Constitution, this is Pat Robertson, the framers of the Constitution left no doubt in the preamble that the Constitution was intended to belong to the people. The people were supposed to be the vigilant guardians of their own liberties. That's the way our system was created. But over the years, the Supreme Court has radically undermined this careful placement of power by making itself the ultimate arbiter and source of what the Constitution provides and what it does not. In 1819, a frustrated Thomas Jefferson concluded that the Constitution, especially the Bill of Rights, has become a mere thing of wax in the hand of the judiciary, which they may twist and shape into any form they please. For decades, the Supreme Court has controlled the Constitution to mean that the people may not decide for themselves through their duly elected officials matters of moral and social importance. Before I read on, what's his main target here? Why is he saying it? What's his main target?
Separation of church and state.
Well, that may be what his main target that he doesn't understand, but what is what's his complaint about?
That the Supreme Court has so-called, I guess, lessened the people's liberty.
Yeah, okay. I'm not expressing my question well enough for you to get it, so I'll just say it. The 77-hour whirlwind trip by Vice President Pence that met with the Pope in the Vatican, what was the point? Abortion. It was about abortion. He's targeting in that the Supreme Court, Roe versus Wade, has protected abortion. Okay, go ahead.
That's in that amendment, the 14th Amendment that was put in place during the Civil War. That's what I think they used those portions of that amendment that's broken down into those parts to do that. exact.
Okay, save your thoughts, because if we get through the notes, we're going to deal with those amendments. So that everything you said was right, but his real battle cry is abortion. This troubling pattern is well documented. For more than a half a century, the Supreme Court has acted as a super legislature, no longer interpreting the Constitution, but rather writing and proclaiming its own law. Consider what the Supreme Court has done since the early 1960s. Prayer and the Bible removed from public schools and the Ten Commandments banned from schools and public places. Relying on what was called the penumbra of the 14th Amendment, granting a right of privacy not found in the Constitution, the court declared abortion a constitutional right while ignoring the constitutional rights of more than 43 million unborn children who have been slaughtered. And now, utilizing the same right of privacy that enshrined abortion, the Supreme Court has proclaimed same-sex sodomy a constitutional right. A growing numbers of Americans see the Supreme Court for what it truly is. After all, no matter how much a legislature may debate, negotiate, compromise, and discuss a significant social issue, a mere 5-member unelected majority of the Supreme Court is always free to impose what it thinks is really best for the American people. This is not a free people at work, but rather a judicial oligarchy of which Jefferson warned. As Jefferson wrote in 1820, to consider the judges as the ultimate arbiters of all constitutional questions is a very dangerous doctrine indeed, and one which would place us under despotism of an oligarchy. The Constitution has erected no such single tribunal. The idea of a living Constitution whose heart and breath ends up being nothing more than the ideological predilections of the Supreme Court sitting members is contrary to the fundamental principles of the rule of law. As Supreme Court Justice Story wrote in 1833, the Constitution is to have a fixed, uniform, permanent construction. It should be, so far at least as human infirmity will allow, not dependent upon the passions or parties of particular times, but the same yesterday, today, and forever. And consider the words of Abraham Lincoln at his first inaugural address in 1861. At the same time, the candid citizen must confess that if the policy of the government upon vital questions affecting the whole people is to be irrevocably fixed by decisions of the Supreme Court, the people will have ceased to be their own rulers, having to that extent practically resigned their government into the hands of that eminent tribunal. Americans are a patient and law-abiding people, but for too long we have watched as the justices on the nation's highest court have legislated from the bench and have taken what was to be our nation's roadmap for the people, the U.S. Constitution, and turn it on its head. It is time for change. And thousands of Americans agree. The time has come for several justices to retire, and I'm fervently praying to that end. Yes.
And all those quotes by Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson, they are all true. They are all true. And so Robertson puts an element of truth in his little speech. What he and other people are doing, but in a much more subtle manner, is what the Catholic Church has been doing for decades. They profess to accept and uphold our Constitution, while at the same time they are very subtly getting in there and actually taking away our constitutional rights, using the words of our statesmen, the founders of our country and other people, to justify that restriction of our religious liberties.
It's two ditches. It's the conservative and liberal ditch. They both have an incorrect approach on the Constitution and its purpose. But leaving that aside, what I want to say is the Supreme Court was a waymark when apostate Protestantism went into apostasy in the 1860s and onward. And now that they're coming to their end, beginning at the time of the end in 1989, the Supreme Court once again is a waymark. Yes.
Another thing what Brother Daniel just said about what they're doing to our Constitution, the Omega movement is doing with our pioneers. They're quoting A.T.
Yes.
Jones, they're quoting all the founding fathers of our very movement
Yes.
and using them in a twisted source, so it's the identical same working.
The Omega movement's philosophy about dispensationalism is saying that the Word of God is a living constitution.
Yes.
It's subject to change based upon the times that we're living in. So they approach the whole thing the same way liberals in the United States do. So they're the Sadducees. But if you're going to get involved with the group, you don't want to get involved with the Sadducees, but you don't want to get involved with the Pharisees either. You want to walk the middle road with Christ. Okay, so you got the Democrats and the Republicans, Sadducees, Pharisees. You want to walk the narrow road. All right. Now, Ralph Reed. Ralph Eugene Reed Jr. is an American political consultant and lobbyist, best known as the first executive director of the Christian Coalition during the early 1900s. He sought the 1990s. He sought the Republican nomination for the office of Lieutenant Governor of Georgia, but lost the primary election on July 18, 2006 to Senator Casey Cagle. Reed started the Faith and Freedom Coalition in 2009. Okay, so Christian Coalition begins in 1989, and 20 years later, in 2009, it's going to morph into the Faith and Freedom Coalition. Here's some of his statements when he was in the Christian Coalition time period. This is Ralph Reed.
Can I give the name?
Go ahead.
Name's meaning?
What?
Ralph means wolf counsel, Eugene means well-born, and Reed means ready or red. So he's a well-born wolf counsel red leader.
Okay. He says, I want to be invisible. I do guerrilla warfare. I paint my face and travel at night. You don't know it's over until you're in the body bag. The story when I used to teach this way back when, the story I used is that they had a district for a congressional district, and they were going to vote on Tuesday, and the Christian Coalition did a mass mailing in that congressional district that hit the homes on Friday. Okay, so that mass mailing hit the homes on Friday where there's no time to respond, and the political person that they were trying to remove from office, what they did in that mass mailing is they reminded the voters that he had been busted for child molesting earlier on in his life. And the day after the election, which he lost, then they made a correction and said that really wasn't him, it was another person of that same name. So when you know they have those kind of stories in their history, and you hear him say, I do guerrilla warfare, I paint my face and travel at night, you don't know it's over till you're in the body bag, he means exactly that. And if you remember, we read quotes by Sister White yesterday that the secret maneuvering that goes on in an underhanded manner, okay, it speaks to the modus operandi of the Christian Coalition.
They were doing in one of the their big meetings, and they were bad-mouthing Ellen White and late into the night, and all the people.
That was 1888.
Yes, 1888. That's exactly what they were doing.
It's like guerrilla warfare. If you reveal your location, all it does is allow your opponent to improve his artillery bearings. It's better to move quietly with stealth under cover of night. You have two choices. You can wear camis and shimmy along on your belly, or you can put on a red coat and stand up for everyone to see. Comes down to whether you want to be the British in the Revolutionary War or the Viet Cong. History tells us which tactic was more effective. Okay, so that's speaking to the idea that Sister White says the National Reform Movement, which is the Christian coalition of our day, works in a secret, underhanded manner. Okay, in 1996...
Slithering on their belly. Like a snake.
Yeah. In 1996, they're going to get taken to court. And they're going to ultimately win. But 1996 is a waymark, right? But I'm saying it's a waymark for them. And what they're going to get taken to court for is crossing over the line about what a religious corporation has the legal right to do. You can't openly support a candidate, in theory. And they're going to get taken to court for it, but they're ultimately going to win, okay? And that's where we're at in politics today. It's pretty much the doors open to churches and religious institutions supporting the candidate of their choice, and that was not how it was in the past. So in 1996, it says, the Federal Election Commission filed suit July 30th, 1996 against the Christian Coalition, accusing the political organization of breaking the law of giving improper aid to Republican candidates for office. Citing examples of the coalition's work with prominent Republican candidates such as former President George Bush, former U.S. Senate candidate Oliver North, and House Speaker Newt Gingrich, the commission alleged that the coalition spent money on voter guides and other get-out-the-vote efforts in conjunction with particular candidates' campaigns. Ralph Reed, executive director of the coalition, which claims 1.7 million members and supporters, contended in a statement that the group has abided by both the letter and the spirit of the law. We are absolutely and totally confident that we will be fully vindicated and courts will affirm the people of faith have every right to be involved as citizens and voters, and ultimately they did win that. But in 1996, the fruit of what they were doing was formalized for anyone that wanted to see, okay? And then 2014, 1888. Right, 2014, we've lined up with 1888. Republicans won a net gain of 9 Senate seats, the largest Senate gain for either party since 1980 United States election. In the House, Republicans won a net gain of 13 seats, giving them their largest majority since the onset of the Great Depression. So by 2014, primarily through the efforts of the National Reform Movement, which is the Christian Coalition, the Republicans take control of the Congress. Okay, they're going to lose it in the 2018 time period, but why are they going to lose it in 2018 midterms? It's not because the National Reform Movement Christian Coalition isn't strong. Why are they going to have a setback and lose the House in 2018? Because providentially, God has to work out this impeachment cycle. It's part of the prophetic development that leads to a civil war. Okay, but they really didn't lose control. They really didn't lose control. Because in 2016, when they get Trump in office, what do they secure for the next
The court.
60 years probably?
Court.
They got the Supreme Court. Just like the Supreme Court was captured in 1992. It gets captured in 2016.
Another thing, the president to put in the most, filled the court the very most of any other president is
Trump.
George Washington. No, you can find it online.
Oh, yeah, he would be, because there wasn't anything to fill. He was filling all of them.
Trump's kind of up there in the high numbers, but Washington's right at the top.
Yeah, okay.
But it's not over yet.
No, Trump won't beat some of the other guys.
But he shows the end from the beginning from the end.
Oh, yeah. That's what I'm saying.
So in the bottom here, I'm not going to deal with this yet, but in Bronwyn's presentation in Sabbath School Superintendent's remarks, she marks 1861, 1863, and 1865 as a chiastic structure, and we're going to start returning to that. And I just want to point out that in 1861, 63, and 65, that if you stand 153 years, and I'm saying 153 is a symbol of prophesy again, that you'll find at the conclusion of 153 years from 1861 brings you to 2014. And there's going to be a message that needs to be presented again in 2014. We'll deal with that later. We're right now still dealing with the end of the apostate Protestantism's rebellion. And this is more current. This is still Ralph Reed I'm dealing with. Render to God and Trump. Ralph Reed calls for 2020 obedience to Trump. An upcoming book by the Faith and Freedom Coalition founder will argue evangelicals have a duty to defend the incumbent GOP leader.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
You have the National Reform Movement, then you had the Christian Coalition, and now are we calling it the Faith and Freedom? What's the new name?
Yes, and if you remember in the article yesterday by A.T. Jones, okay, As he tracks the development of the National Reform Movement, he tracks alliances that take place through their history. You have the notes from yesterday. You can see them. There's several alliances. It began with an alliance with the Women's Temperance League. Okay, so the idea that there is a ongoing development of who the Christian Coalition is as it moves through history is consistent with the National Reform Movement. Okay, that's part of their characteristics.
So you're not calling it the Christian Coalition anymore, now we're labeling it Faith and Freedom Coalition.
Yeah, he started a new organization, and you gotta look at Ralph Reed. He's the one that was the guru of the Christian Coalition, and he's worked on lots of Republican candidates' campaigns since then.
It's even changed since you started ministry, because when you started ministry, you were
Christian
interviewing at the Christian Coalition.
Yes.
We were the middle one.
So it's been updated. Okay.
Yeah. One of Donald Trump's most prominent Christian supporters will argue in a book due out before the 2020 general election that American evangelicals have a moral obligation to enthusiastically back the president. The book's author, Faith and Freedom Coalition founder Ralph Reed, became a loyal foot soldier for Trump immediately after he nabbed the Republican presidential nomination in 2016, commanding hordes of white evangelical voters from his perch on the candidate's religious advisory board to trust that the New York businessman would grow the economy, defend religious freedom, and dismantle federal protections for abortion if elected. According to the book's description obtained by Politico, the original title for the book was Rendered to God and Trump, a reference to the well-known biblical verse, "Render to Caesar the things that are Caesar." The message from Jesus in Matthew 22 has been used in contemporary politics to justify obedience to government, or in the case of Reed's book, to Trump. Regnery Publishing confirmed the book's existence, but said the title is For God and Country, the Christian Case for Trump. The publisher declined to comment on the reason for the title change. In his book, Reed will pervasively argue evangelicals have a duty to defend the incumbent Republican leader against the stridently anti-Christian, anti-Semitic, and pro-abortion agenda of the progressive left, according to the description. So, if you go back to page 3, what I'm saying is, on the top there, where you have the line of apostate Adventism begins, and then you have the line false prophet begins, and then what we just went over was false prophet ends. They began in 1989. By what we mark happened in 1994? In 1994, it has representatives in every voting precincts in the United States. 1996, they get attacked for crossing the line between separation of church and state. In 2016, Donald Trump's put in office, and he is going to secure the Supreme Court for them, and now they're pushing for the 2020 election. This line has a very similar footprints as the beginning of the National Reform Movement. The Christian Coalition is repeating those footsteps heading to the Sunday Law. And what the National Reform Movement accomplished, it still stands in the record books from 1892 that this is a Christian nation. Okay, so now on page 7, I'm going back to Browen's presentation on Sabbath, and I want to do just a couple things so it's more accurate to what she was saying. You put this here and this here, make this 1840, and take this out, make this 1844, and this 1846, because she was emphasizing a chiastic structure of 15 years and 15 years. And she's saying that Miller is raised up here, the prelude to the denomination that becomes the Seventh-day Adventist Church. And by 1861, it's 30 years. And then she's going to track this chiastic structure here of 1861 to 1865. So too here, the Liberty Bell is put in place. This is a bell with a crack in it. In 1846, this was what she was, and this is leading up to the Civil War. And okay, and what we're saying is, we have several 30s that we can look at. But the 30s, her argument is if we could, I don't know if this is her argument, but my interpretation of her argument is if we can show this phenomenon 2 or 3 times, then it's established. Okay, and we have 30 years from 1989 to 2019. Very specific 30 years. Midnight, November 9th, 1989, to midnight, November 9th, 2019. We have another 30-year period from 1991 to 2021, associated with the King of the South, the demise of the Soviet Union in 1991, the end of Russia in 1991. So we have lots of 30-year periods that we can plug in here, but let's just walk through these. We won't have to spend a great deal of time on these because she has already dealt with them. 1831, she deals with Miller's name. He is the chief or the leader that seeks to do God's will and protects God's will. He's the protector, the defender of the faith, and he grinds the grain. He's a miller. And what's the miller do? She says he grinds the grain and makes the bread. That's all right. That works. But he separates the wheat from the chaff also. Okay. And she's going to compare it with this person here that is the beginning point of the Civil War. In 1846, which she's marking at the center of this chiastic structure, you have the marriage and Sabbath. Ellen White's married to James White. They begin observing Sabbath. Those were the 2 things that she marked. I'm going to put marriage up here. I didn't know where she was going on Sabbath, and so I was adding some other things that took place there, but not to downplay her emphasis. Now I know where she was going, but also I won't put them up there with them. I'll put them here. There was a baptism. Sister White was rebaptized and her name was changed. Okay. In 1861, the publishing houses, the work of Adventism begins to be incorporated. Okay, but even prior to here, they didn't just do it instantly. There's a development, a controversy that goes on leading up to it. In 1860, their youngest son dies. Their oldest son's going to die here. And that is typifying Jericho. They're getting ready to rebuild Jericho in 1863, which is part of the story. And here they become an official denomination and they reject the pillar of prophecy, and substitute it with Uriah Smith's 1863 chart. And what this is doing is it's introducing Elijah. Okay, now go to 1 Kings chapter 16, the very last verse. 1 Kings chapter 16. We're all familiar with chapter 17, chapter 18. This is Elijah going to Carmel, Elijah then fleeing from Jezebel's threat. But if you are on chapter 16, verse
34.
Yeah, but verse 29 is, I'm going to start a little bit early. And in the 38th year of Asa, king of Judah, began Ahab the son of Omri to reign over Israel. And Ahab the son of Omri reigned over Israel in Samaria 22 years. 38 and 22. And Ahab the son of Omri did evil in the sight of the Lord above all that were before him. And it came to pass, as if it had been a light thing for him to walk in the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, that he took to wife Jezebel, the daughter of Ethbaal, king of the Zidonians, and went and served Baal and worshipped him. And he reared up an altar for Baal in the house of Baal, which he had built in Samaria. And Ahab made a grove, and Ahab did more to provoke the Lord God of Israel to anger than all the kings of Israel that before him. So here's an introduction, because what's going to come now is Elijah is going to be raised up to deal with Ahab. And in the midst of Elijah being raised up to deal with Ahab, you have this final verse. And it says, in his days, in Ahab's days, did Hiel the Bethelite build Jericho, for he laid the foundation thereof in Abiram his firstborn, and set up the gates thereof in his youngest son Segub, according to the word of the Lord, which he spake by Joshua the son of Nun. If you go back now to Joshua 6:26, it says, and Joshua adjured them at that time, saying, cursed be the man before the Lord that raiseth up and buildeth this city Jericho, for he shall lay the foundation thereof in his firstborn, and his youngest son shall he set up the gates of it. So what we have identified in the past.
Do you know what that literally means in 1 Kings 16:34 when it says he laid the foundation in his firstborn? Was there a literal death that went on of his?
Yes.
Or did he sacrifice him to build that?
No, he died during that time. He didn't do sacrifice.
They just died.
They died as a curse. Cursed be the man.
Okay.
Okay, so we've identified through symbolism, prophetic symbolism, gates, and we all know this. What's a gate symbolize? The church. Okay, right here is where the gates are being set up. It's a progressive walk from here to where it's fully incorporated here. And his other son is going to die when the foundations are laid. And what are the foundations? The foundations are these two tables that were replaced here. The satanic foundation was put in place. The church was put in place. This history, they're rebuilding Jericho. This is Jericho. Okay, this is Jericho. It's important to see because this movement's been led to identify that this here is the second coming of Christ. But it's not. We read two quotes yesterday. Jericho is a Sunday law. This is a Sunday law. Now you can argue, well, the universal Sunday law takes you to the close of human probation when Michael stands up, and that is the second coming of Christ. But that's a weak argument when you're going to get technical about this history. So, moving on.
2014 and 1888
Are saying it's rebellion.
What?
2014 is rebellion.
Yeah. Yeah, and you're making a statement. Do you have a question?
And they're saying it was a Sunday law.
No, I'm saying it's a Sunday law.
2014, 1863.
I'm saying that the building of Jericho is a symbol of the Sunday law because we read two quotes yesterday that when they brought down Jericho, Sister White lines it up with the Sunday law. So when you see Jericho, it is a symbol of the Sunday law, and Jericho is rebuilt right here. So when you're going into this history of Millerite Adventism and you're going to bring it to the end of the world and you want to identify what 1863 is typifying, it's typifying the Sunday law. It is not typifying the second coming of Christ.
It would seem to me that the rebuilding of Jericho would be similar to the building of the Tower of Babel. And the meaning of those two sons, Abiram and Segub, Abiram means lofty, and Segub almost the same, aloft. So you have the tower, which is aloft.
Pride.
Or like rebuilding Babylon, however you want to put it.
Yep. Pride is there too. And that's what Babylon is. Okay. Now going back into this history, we're just putting some characteristics with these waymarks. There's a 30 years period here that leads to 1861 through 65, also in the prelude to the Civil War. One of the things that we've been instructed here recently that's absolutely incorrect is that the activity and the work of Abraham Lincoln was unrighteous. It was righteous. Okay, so it's 180 degrees from the truth. Okay, so in this history here, you have William Lloyd Garrison, another William raised up, and he's going to be the one that begins the abolition movement that's going to ultimately get to the Emancipation Proclamation here, where the slaves are freed in 1863 legally. And the symbol of his movement, the symbol of his publication, is the Liberty Bell. His publication's named after the Liberty Bell. And
The Liberty Bell's named after his publication.
the Liberty Bell is named after his publication.
I believe so. I think his magazine, The Liberator, kind of incorporated the state house bell, because that's all it ever used to be, and it began to be known as the...
Oh, that's even better.
I'm sure.
His publication ultimately gets...
Okay.
This was the State House Bell, but it ultimately becomes known as the Liberty Bell, and it's based upon his work on seeking to free the slaves in the United States. And what's his point of reference for doing so? The Bible, and the Bible alone. And what do they call it? The statement above the bell, whatever they call the inscription, is the Jubilee pronouncement in Leviticus 25. Okay, and what's the Jubilee about? 50. It's 50, but it's setting the slaves free in the 50th year. Okay, so you got Leviticus 25 here. What is the first prophecy that William Miller discovered?
25.
Where did he discover it?
Leviticus.
Get more specific.
25.
Leviticus 26. But how did he correctly interpret it? What did he have to use to correctly interpret it? Leviticus 25. Yeah, if you don't have Leviticus 25, you don't understand what the curse and blessing of the 25:20 is. You do not understand the number value of it. Okay, it's based upon the numerology of the Jubilee cycle that William Miller comes to understand that the 7 times has to be 2,520 years. So here with William Garrison in 1846, you've got Leviticus 25 noted, and back here in 1831 with Miller, his first prophetic revelation is Leviticus 25. So there's a parallel there between what? What is this history in terms of the Protestant Reformation?
When we could have finished it up.
This was supposed to be the climax of the Protestant Reformation. This was supposed to be the horn of Protestantism, perfected, brought to purity, but it's going to fall over here. What is this? This is the horn of republicanism. And both falls are going to be on the first day of the first month. On terms of the horns, but the republicanism comes in our lifetime at 9/11. Okay, you have the crack here in the bell that makes it cease to sound, and it's cool that its final sound was on Washington's birthday. Yeah, go ahead.
It's also a doubling of that bell. I didn't have a chance to talk about it, but that bell, it's the second one that was cast, because the first one was cast with such a impure that the first time they did it, it busted apart. And so it had to be casted in the United States instead of England where they originally casted it. So there's a doubling of that bell if you want to be able to mark.
A doubling?
A doubling. I don't know what that meant. I couldn't tie it in. But it is the second bell. This one done, one in the on the earth and the sea, that beast that has that connection. I don't know.
First one cast in Europe, the sea.
Sent over here.
And then over here on the earth.
Okay, I don't know.
And the historical evidence in Cromwell's testimony on Sabbath was that this crack represents the crack, the racial crack, all right, between black and white in the United States. But I'm arguing that also this is the beginning of the crack between the Democrats and Republicans, because when Abraham Lincoln gets elected in 1861, you have your first Republican president, and now you're going to have this division between Republicans and Democrats going down through history. So there's that crack as well.
When Washington was in office, he was against parties, against
Political parties.
He was totally against it, and the implication in his speeches was that if you did that, it would ultimately cause division in this country. It would promote division in this country, and so
That crack comes on his birthday.
yes, and so I believe it signifies that this country is no longer united. It's breaking up. Another thing that could symbolize also the fact that what Bronwyn said, that it was first cast in Britain, and then it just busted up. Our freedoms started here in this country. We didn't get them from the old world. I'm saying it probably in a crummy way, but that's the facts.
We got one thing from the old world. We got English law.
Yeah.
The Constitution is based upon English law, but it got turned into Roman law at 9/11. Larry?
I was wanting to piggyback off yesterday's in regards to the slavery and the homosexuality. You mentioned a little bit about this. So with the bell cracking and the separation, can we line that up with the apostate movement coming in here and tying in slavery with homosexuality and calling those equal, and so we separated from them because of that?
No, we did not separate from them.
They separated from us.
Right.
Thank you. Yeah.
That's let me move forward. A little bit of thought on that as I go a little bit forward. 10 days before the inauguration, I'm on page 9 of your notes on Abraham Lincoln. The last part there, it says 10 days before the inauguration. The next morning on Washington's birthday, February 22nd, 1861. I'm down here with Abraham Lincoln.
What page are you on?
I'm on page 9, the bottom. Okay, he's not, the inauguration isn't taking place, it's 10 days before. Lincoln and his 7-year-old son Tad mounted to open carriage and rode 3 blocks to Independence Hall. Lincoln entered the assembly room of Independence Hall for the first time. The last time he's going to enter it is when he comes in a casket. Same place, okay? The room was a patriotic shrine that had been redecorated by the city in 1854 and 1855. The Liberty Bell sat in the corner on an octagonal pedestal that was decorated with flags, columns, and the names of the signers of the Declaration of Independence. William Rush's sculpture of George Washington stood in the center of the east wall, flanked by the portraits of William Penn and Lafayette. So when he's getting ready to begin his presidency 10 days before, he's in the very place where this bell is now stored, because it don't ring no more. In 1846, on Washington's birthday, it cracked, it's never going to ring again. It becomes the symbol of the abolitional movement, and they put it in this hall. And on Washington's birthday, 5 years later, to the very day, Lincoln comes there for the first time in that hall, and that's where he's going to go for his funeral. 15 years later, yes. Okay, so that's just I asked Bronwyn if she could pull it together to do a follow-up, because I'm not going to the depth that she did on this stuff. 1863, Lincoln's giving the Gettysburg Address, which amounts to 273 words, and it's the foundation of America. Because it's a foundation of republicanism. Somewhere in the last 2 weeks in Sabbath school, I think it was Daniel, maybe not, but I think it was Daniel, went in the Great Controversy and gave the basic definition of what republicanism is. And it's a government that its number one purpose is to protect individual rights. Okay? And that's what the Gettysburg Address is, that all men are created equal. And what's the 273? Okay, because July 4th is Independence Day, and this was Independence Hall where this is going on. And on July 4th, 2020, you're going to be at the end of 100 days of prayer for the Adventist Church, and this 273 is about March. It just there's many things going on here, all right? So, but this is the foundation here. This foundation is right here where this foundation. This is a false foundation here, the 1863 chart. This is the true foundation that's still being protected by Abraham Lincoln at this point. 1863, when this takes place, 1 times 8 times 6 times 3 is 144. The symbol of the 144,000. Okay, now in the battle of, we'll have to take up these battles. I have to do, when you get to the end of the Civil War, this is bigger than I thought. When you get to the end of the Civil War, they're going to have 3 amendments that speak to the ramifications, the conclusion of abolition and freeing the slaves. The 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, and there's details in those amendments that speak to our history, but if you add 13, 14, and 15, it comes to 42, which is a symbol of persecution. And now, let me just take a few minutes, because I wanted to get to here, to the Ottoman Empire, all right? 1831, 30 years takes you to where? Right over here in 1861. All right, so we've already put 1831 in the record. What was 1831? It was the first Ottoman-Egyptian War from 1831 to 1833. There, the king of the south prevailed. There's going to be a second Ottoman War down here in 1839 to 41. So in this history here, you have 1840, the restraint of Islam. This history, though, starting in 1831, and I'm going to take it out here to 1861. The ruler Abdulmajid I from 1839, which is here, the second Ottoman-Egyptian War, where this time the king of the north prevailed over the king of the south. I'm saying that because this is some of the support for Daniel 11. Okay, so in 1839 they've got a ruler in the Ottoman Empire that is going to rule until 1861 to here. Okay. In this history, in 1839, the solar calendar was introduced, the Islamic calendars introduced in 1839, and they began their calendar in the year 622. So they have 622 here marked. In 1846, the Ottoman Empire has its first parliament put in place, parliament. But they also print a stamp for the first time. A stamp, sister, what the Bible, Spirit of Prophecy together teach that the sealing of God's people, she says, when the stamp is impressed, okay, the stamp is a symbol of the seal. The seal is Sabbath, marriage, baptism, name changed. Okay, so there's a connection there with 1846 in this history of the Ottoman Empire. And what I'm saying is that all the players at the end of the world, the subjects of Bible prophecy, Russia, the dragon beast, false prophet, Islam, and the United States are all a subject of prophecy, and they're going to reach their conclusion at the end of the world under the same judgment. It's the same judgment. His dealings with men are ever the same, and the conclusion of the Ottoman Empire is being illustrated in this beginning history. It's the end of the sixth trumpet, second woe, and it's pointing forward to the arrival of the third woe, seventh trumpet. Okay, they start their post office in 1863. You have a picture of the first stamp, and probably most of you in this room, maybe on here, will not know what I'm talking about. And I barely know, but I do remember it because when I was a little boy, I used to watch a lot of TV, and I know there was movies about this. How many have ever heard of the Charge of the Light Brigade? Have you? So if we're the very last generation, we're the generation that can still remember these things, and probably the only reason we remember them is maybe because of television, maybe because we were students in some history class. That wasn't my case. I really can't tell you what the Charge of the Light Brigade was, but it was a famous battle from the Crimean War. And what's the Crimean War? It's a war that's going on in this history here between Russia and the Ottoman Turks. And why is there a war between Russia and the Ottoman Turks going on? One of the main reasons is on page 12, this note. In 1839-1840, with British support, the challenge posed by Egypt was dealt with. We understand that as Seventh-day Adventists. Okay, a restraint is placed upon Egypt. The Ottomans have surrendered into the hands of the four great European powers their sovereignty. In 1852, found another enemy, Russia. Russia becomes an enemy to Islam. Okay? At French request, the Sultan had ordered the key of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre handed over to the Catholic community. The Tsar of Russia, claiming to be the protector of the Ottoman Empire, Ottoman Christians, demanded the key be returned to her former holders. When this demand was not fulfilled, Russia declared war, the Crimean War. What is that? What's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre? It's a church in Israel that Catholics claim that this is where Jesus was crucified or born, one or the other. It's one of these idols of Catholicism. There's a 12-inch long key, and when Islam took control of the Middle East, they ended up with this key. They still have this key to this very day. So the key to this war, which was a big war and a famous war, I did a little bit of Googling on it, it had a really big influence on world history, okay, but we don't know about it anymore. And the key was, it was an argument over who's going to control this Catholic idol. And the focus of this war was between Russia and Ottoman, between Islam and the King of the South. Okay? That's the best way I can shrink it down. And when you get to 1865, all right, in the year 1865, the majority of the Circassians, a Muslim people living north of the Caucasus Mountains, whose resistance against Russia's rule had failed, immigrated into the Ottoman Empire. So here you have a separation. No, here. Separation from Islam and Russia. And when we get to it, I'm going to argue this, that this is the first Sunday law of July 18th, this way mark, and that this is the second Sunday law. And there's a separation here between Russia and Islam because Russia comes to an end. Okay, and this is being marked with the Crimean War. And I'll just go over these once because we'll have to do with them again and bring this to a conclusion. I obviously have more to do. We haven't even begun to fill in how this would line up at the end of the world, which we intend to do. Thou must prophesy again. I'm on page 13. And he said unto me, thou must prophesy again before many peoples and nations and tongues and kings. Revelation 10:11. Revelation 10:11 in the European calendar is January 11th. 1861 to 2014 is 153 years. 1863 to 2016, 153 years. Same here with 1865, it's 153 years to take you to 2018. Just a couple examples. In the movement of the 144,000, that would mean 2014 is the arrival of Ezra 7:9. The 2016 is the arrival of Raphi and Peniam. And the 2018 is the arrival of November 9th. Okay? So, thou must prophesy again on 3 witnesses is talking about the development of the midnight cry message in this movement. The starting points come from these 3 histories. Therefore, these 3 histories are going to speak to that history in our time period. Now, when it comes to the Omega, did I put that in there? Yes. Okay, here you got a Sunday law with a question mark. Okay, a false prophecy to counteract the true. In 2016, you have the introduction of the false methodology. And in 2018, you have the crazy predictions about November 9th. Same years. They're all 153. So we have to prophesy again in the Midnight Cry message on 3 steps. And part of the story of the Midnight Cry message is it takes place when the Omega apostasy is doing a counterfeit. In terms of Trump, 2014, the midterms. The Christian Coalition has taken control of the Congress of the United States. 2016, Trump, the man that's going to take control of the Supreme Court for him, he's elected. 2018, they don't lose the Senate, but they lose the House of Representatives, because the House of Representatives is going to have to be used providentially to produce this impeachment argument, which is going to escalate into the Civil War and the despotism that we're seeing taking place around us. Okay, so that's a direction that we're going. Thanks for the extra time again. Shall we pray? Heavenly Father, we are amazed at the consistency of your word, the consistency of history when looked at properly. And we thank you that you're allowing us to be among those that are seeing these things unfold. As we consider the responsibility of giving this final warning message to Nashville and then beyond, we ask that you'd bless us with discernment, wisdom on how to say the words right and get it accomplished in a timely fashion. And as we take up our task today, we ask that you'd protect us and let us be productive. And we ask a blessing upon the work we're doing in live streaming these things here. In Jesus' name, amen.